So this past week, I binged Goth, the trilogy, and I have quite a handful of things to say about these movies. So I was promised that the X trilogy is an absolute masterpiece, and one thing people should know about me is don't overhype things to me. Because then I'm gonna go into the movie with said standards, and if what I'm consuming doesn't live up to the hype as you promised, you're kind of dead to me. So what do I think of Goth, the trilogy? Kinda an enjoyable but pretty Starting with X being the first entry into this trilogy, and right out the gate, I'll say this right now. This is unquestionably the weakest entry in this trilogy. X tries to pay homage to old school slashers while giving it a little bit more depth, but the issue is that yes, it has more depth than most slashers do, but it's not a very high bar to pass, so it's not saying much. The presentation of the movie's theme and sub-themes are so poorly fleshed out and feels very surface level, and it doesn't really dig very deep. It doesn't help either that the film constantly just beats you over the head with what the theme is, constantly reminding you not to accept a life you don't deserve. Like, I think I could piece it together by the way Maxine behaves.
You're a fucking sex symbol.
I'm a fucking star!
It was already established from the beginning that she's the type of person that does whatever it takes to get whatever she wants, no matter how morally depraved it can be. Speaking of which, Maxine isn't actually the greatest character. I don't mean morally either, but her presentation in the film. Don't get me wrong, Goth is giving a performance of a lifetime, but the writing behind her character just about lines up with everything in the movie. A very surface level analysis with not a lot of depth. I understand that she was purposely written to be a deprived narcissistic lunatic, desperate for fame and glory, and it doesn't go any deeper than that. Like, why does she want the famous spotlight so badly? No clue. The movie doesn't really make it very clear. If you're just gonna tell me things and not show me, like you already have with most of the story already, might as well tell me some basic character traits for me to understand the character, like, I don't know, their motivation. Understanding what our character wants isn't always necessarily considered depth, especially if it's just told to us. Not to mention, she's not a dynamic character either. She's literally the same person through and through by the end of the film. I understand this is supposed to be a trilogy, and she's gonna develop as... Actually, you know what? We'll come back to that when we get around to Maxine. I think what really ruined the movie for me though was how sloppy the last act of the movie was. It was so apparent that the film was self-aware that its runtime was running out, so it started rushing and cramming everything in all at once. It remembered it's a slasher film, so it starts killing off the characters debatably unceremoniously at times. I know this film is still trying to pay homage to old school slashers, but it sets itself up to be a slasher with more depth the way it builds things up, leading to the final act. So that means you can't just suddenly throw everything out the window in honor of slasher traditions. It is such a huge mishandling of most of the cast. You can make an argument that they're all there just to be cannon fodder, but most of them seem to have a story arc that was going somewhere, only to get killed off before it comes to a true end. Not saying all the kills were unceremonious, some of them had weight to them. Like when Pearl kills RJ, for example, it was a turning point for her to finally take back what she believes she deserves. If anything, it was a huge turning point in the narrative overall. When Howard killed Jackson, it showed it was out of envy and Howard's own insecurity that a guy like him could no longer please his wife. Then there's this former Marine walking around showing how he's still able, thus making Howard feel less of a man. Every other death though just felt like shock value because of slasher tradition. But wait, where's slasher with depth? We have an actual theme to our story, so here it is. Here's the theme. Bet you couldn't figure it out for yourselves, fucking idiots. I know I've been mostly negative with X, but in the end, I didn't think it was terrible. I enjoyed bits and pieces here and there, but I'm just ultimately saying that it has all it needs to be a better film, but it doesn't use them to its fullest. The movie definitely has an identity crisis and wasn't able to commit to something. Like, it tries to have an introspective commentary on its sub-themes by using old school slashers as a backdrop, but in the end, it played too heavily into its tropes of a genre it was honoring, and it hurts the storytelling in the end. So now let's talk about the next entry in the franchise. We got Pokemon Pearl. Pearl is the second entry to the trilogy, but it's actually a prequel to X. In fact, Pearl serves as an origin story for X's main antagonist, being the titular character. We got Pokia, baby. While X was an unfocused mess, Pearl is a lot more concise with what it wants to be and tried to be. It is very clear that Pearl is an actual character study, and it actually focuses on the titular character most of the time, giving her a full story arc from beginning to end. Pearl actually has motivation on why she wants to be famous, and it all comes down to how she hates her life back on the farm, and she's actually quite dynamic because she starts out by not having that many screws loose in her mind and by the end, all the nuts and bolts are completely out the window. What makes Pearl have more depth over Maxine as a character is the dynamic she has with her mother. Throughout the film, she's often butting heads with her mother or just simply doesn't like what her mother expects of her, which prevents Pearl from fulfilling her dreams. But the film doesn't cheaply antagonize her mother either to score cheap sympathy points for Pearl. But the circumstance they're put in because of the film's setting taking place during World War I make you understand her mother's perspective and even agree with her. But we as an audience are still able to sympathize with Pearl as well, just for following her dreams. At the end, the movie actually makes a strong case that Pearl is a victim of circumstance. The world is at war at this time. Germans aren't looked upon very fondly in America, and there's a sickness going around which forces Pearl's mother to take extra caution to keep her family healthy to survive, and that comes at the cost of Pearl's dream to become a star. I'm a star! So when Pearl snaps after Superman rejects her, it feels natural and organic, not contrived. Hey look, it's Superman! You understand Pearl's struggles up to this point, and the movie does a good job at presenting it, so it's natural that eventually she's going to snap. Every murder that takes place actually felt earned by the movie. It doesn't do things as a shock factor or to pay homage to a genre that would actively clash with what the movie wants to be. So going back to the point how Pearl is a much more dynamically written character, at the end, despite everything her mother has put her through, she comes back around to care for her mother and even appreciates her for everything. Pearl isn't just a dumb lunatic, but she's also a very self-aware and presented to be a much smarter character than we'd perceive of a lunatic. Now that's not to say everything is perfect, because the movie still sort of slightly fumbles with some of its presentation. Most noticeable when Pearl gives her full confession to her sister-in-law Mitzi. In fact, X made the same mistake as well. Both movies have a point where they try to disguise themselves that they're performing a show don't tell, but really they're just info dumping onto us. In X, it was when everyone gathered around at dinner and that whole conversation was literally just to tell you what the movie's theme and thesis is. If anything, that whole dialogue exchange felt like it was structured as a high school debate essay. We have one character presenting the argument, then another presents a counter argument to the point of argument, then you have another character presenting a counter argument to the counter argument, then their essay wraps up with a conclusion tying the thesis back into it. Don't get me wrong, this debate structure in writing an essay is a good starting point to follow, and a movie doesn't follow it to the T, but the presentation of it felt very juvenile. At least in Pearl, when the movie info dumped onto us on Pearl's feelings about everything, you can make a solid argument that the movie was actually showing Pearl's realization of the mess she has caused. Overall, I quite like Pearl. It pays homage to films of the 20s and 30s with modern sensibilities, and it carries an appropriately quirky go-getter tone most of the time, making it a more charismatic movie. X felt like a one and done to me. It's just filler homework leading to the trilogy's conclusion, whereas Pearl actually earned its place in the trilogy. Oh yeah, Goth also put on an amazing performance, once again. If anything, in a performance perspective, I think I like her performance better here. I know that Pearl is supposed to be a companion piece to X, and it does a good job at fleshing out X a little more, but it still doesn't make up for X's technical and mechanical presentation. Now, we finally reached the finale. What do I think of Maxine? So to preface, I feel like it's worth mentioning that at the time of writing the script, I just got back home from the theaters after seeing this movie. Overall, I quite enjoyed it. It is also a huge improvement over X. Firstly, the movie structure actually had direction to it. The plot felt like it was actually moving along, and it was actually moving along a lot more organically compared to X. Maxine definitely has a murder mystery thriller approach, and this time it actually executes well on its concepts. On top of that, it actually appropriately pays homage to the slasher genre. Like, this is how you pay homage without jeopardizing the core identity of the movie. What I'm talking about is the gore isn't there for shock value. It doesn't feel out of place. It actually serves a purpose. The example during the movie that I'm thinking of was when our mystery antagonist murdered Maxine's friend Leon. The way the scene played out definitely felt like a slasher film, thus paying homage, but the scene also adds agency to the plot because our mystery Night Stalker antagonist is trying to leverage her dead friends against her to bring her out. However, this film still treads some of the same mistakes X did. It was beating you over the head with its theme over and over again, and the last act was when things started to fall apart as well. Once again, spoilers. My main issue with the final act is how they try to play up Maxine turning a new leaf and becoming the hero that the city needs to bring an end to the mystery Night Stalker antagonist. Literally, the flashback she had leading into it really felt that way. You literally have one flashback literally telling her that she needs to save whoever the next victim might be, and some others the victims have said to her before their demise. The reason it's so inappropriate to build up her hero moment is because literally the scene before that, she participated in a literal murder. There was nothing heroic about it. Now, that may not have been the the writer's intentions to build her up as a hero, but it sure does read like that, making a noticeable disconnect in the story presentation. Then an odd plot hole towards the end. Once again, major spoilers, she straight up executed her dad after having the police tell her repeatedly to drop the gun, and then after that, her life moves on like normal. I'm pretty sure what she did was literally a crime. The dude literally no longer poses a threat, so you can't say it was a self-defense moment. No, it was a straight-up execution at that point. But ultimately, it comes back to the way it ties its themes together of confronting your past and claim the life you deserve. Because literally nothing Maxine earned in this movie and has claimed she does not deserve any of it. Everything was super unearned on her behalf. So at this point, there's sort of a few ways to interpret what's going on. If it's an argument that Maxine confronted her past and came out on top, well, they didn't really do a good job at showing us that, because all she really does is show herself to her dad, then being saved by the two detectives that's been trailing her. You can't say Maxine was truly victorious in confronting her past either. I mean, I guess you can say she at least made the effort, but ultimately the two detectives did most of the work for her, so it felt very unearned when she stood over her dad triumphantly when it was the two detectives that downed him for her. Then the way they tried to tie back to the continuous theme throughout the trilogy of not accepting the life you do not deserve. Once again, there's a couple ways to interpret this. First interpretation is that it's inconsistent writing, because it's very clear that Maxine doesn't deserve the life she reaped at the end of the movie. She literally stood on the shoulders of other people. But then that's where the second interpretation comes in. That theme is a running oxymoron for Maxine. It's intentionally ironic, which I kind of fucking doubt. It ties back to her nonstop desire for fame that she'll do whatever it takes to get it. So it's an oxymoron to show how delusional Maxine is as a character to believe she actually deserved the stardom she received, because the movie has shown us that she doesn't deserve it, which makes sense because one of the main commentaries of this movie was the dirty and cutthroat world of Hollywood, which is honestly appropriate coming from an A24 film, since they give their filmmakers the creative liberty to create the films that they want to make, whereas Hollywood tends to have a lot of investors and studio heads interfering with creative visions. So a movie critiquing the cutthroat nature of Hollywood coming from them feels fitting. So remember how I said earlier we get back around to Maxine as a character that develops with the trilogy? Yeah, well, even in Maxine, she doesn't really develop as a character either. She worked up the courage to do something she doesn't want to do, but she doesn't really change into a different person after that. So the argument that she is supposed to develop as the franchise goes on still doesn't justify her lack of character development. The only thing that really developed about her is where she is in life between movies, but overall, she's still the same person through and through. I guess that's meant to serve as a commentary on how bad of a person she truly is. So to all the naysayers that like to say you can't say an individual story is bad because we don't know how it serves the surrounding stories, you're forgetting that a good story isn't just what the story is about, but the way it is presented and told to the audience. The story in X was not presented well, so even if it serves a good purpose in the overall story of the trilogy, it doesn't justify how poorly the screenplay was written.
Do not deserve.
I'm not totally in love with Maxine, but I don't dislike it even remotely as much as X. At least with Maxine being a much more dynamic movie and fixing some of the mistakes with X makes it much more enjoyable while I'm watching the movie. It's not the movie that I'll watch again, but I can at least look back and say I enjoyed this movie. Not saying it's flawless by any means, obviously, just that it was at least enjoyable. So my main takeaway on this whole Mia Goth adult film star trilogy is that the trilogy is kind of flat. I mean, the message it is conveying is most certainly there, but the creative decisions in making most of these movies were rather poorly executed. X wasn't structurally sound, and Maxine fumbled at the finish line. It seems that literally Pearl was the only one in the trilogy that felt like a complete and competent movie. Honestly, I think Pearl is the only one really worth watching as a standalone. Forget how it ties in with the other two films, forget the fact that it's meant to be a companion piece, watch it as a standalone and it is much more worthy of standing on its own 2 feet. If anything, it's Pearl that holds up the entire trilogy, which is ironic because Maxine is the main focus of this trilogy of movies. Like I said though, I don't completely despise this trilogy. It just has more subpar products than it does competent products. I know it looks like I've been much harsher than I was positive with this movie trilogy, but it's more so that it doesn't match up to the hype that was promoted to me. And that's really my main takeaway. Alright y'all, that's really all I have to say. Until next time, see you. Okay, so y'all, I went to sleep after writing the original script, and after waking up and actually looking at what other people have to say on Letterboxd, I got some more thoughts, because that's what we need. More thoughts, baby, so here we go. So apparently I'm not in the minority for Maxine. However, it seems all the Maxine apologists seem to not really like this movie very much, whereas I, who didn't like Maxine very much, liked this movie a decent bit more. I think simple things like a change of setting just went a long way for me to enjoy Maxine. The more I think about it, I don't feel like X did anything interesting with the farm it took place on. I mean, yeah, it does serve its purpose, but beyond that, it's kind of lame. It really screams that this movie was shot on a budget. I'm not saying X had to do anything special with its setting. I'm just saying the fact that Maxine had a more dynamic setting made it more enjoyable for me to watch. I also see people saying this trilogy is pretty pretentious, and I actually wouldn't say it is, especially when this piece of shit exists. I also came to realize that as a whole, this movie doesn't have a lot of payoff. So I'm going to reiterate that everything regarding the character of Maxine is very undeserved and unearned. In fact, everything in the Maxine duology is unearned. Even in X, she didn't actually survive with her own wits. Most she did was make a lucky duck when Pearl blasted the shotgun at her, and then Pearl broke her hip from it, allowing Maxine to leave. Literally, she only made it out alive because of happenstance.
I've fallen, and I can't get up!
So let's answer the question. Is the Mia Goth origin story trilogy worth watching? Well, it kind of depends. If you're a completionist like me, then honestly, it's not the biggest waste of time. They're very digestible movies because of how short they are and the fact that, well, you know, the movies don't have much to say most of the time. But the performances from the cast in every movie were also very enjoyable to watch. However, if you're delicate with your time, then honestly Pearl is the only one I feel is worth a real watch. Honestly, you could watch it just as a standalone. In fact, the more I separate Pearl from the rest in my mind, the more I appreciate Pearl. Pearl is really the only film in the trilogy that can stand on its own 2 feet, even if it fumbles on them here and there. Another reason to watch the whole trilogy is if you're just a simply Mia Goth fan, because she really does put up a damn performance in these movies. However, I am of the belief that you should be able to have your own opinion and should experience things before you do have an opinion. So with that logic, everything is worth a watch if you have the time for it. So let's close out by grading each of these movies. I give X a I will not accept a lack of a third act out of 10. As for the Pokemon Pearl remake, it gets a brilliant diamond out of 10. And Maxine, well, it gets a not Maxine mother effing Minx out of 10. Alright, see you nerds.
Maxine fucking
Hey, it's me, Goku!